Greetings. I'm Yvonne Stapp for Science for the Public, and I welcome you to Contemporary Science Issues and Innovations. There is a long tradition of resistance to scientific facts. The continuing objections to the COVID vaccine, public health mandates, and also increased right-wing anti-science views underscore how damaging this mentality can get. Our guest today has spent years addressing the anti-science issue. Lee Mcintyre is a research fellow at the Center for Philosophy and History of Science at Boston University. He is the author of several popular books on the importance of scientific facts in contemporary civilization and the issue of resistance to scientific facts. In his latest book, How to Talk to a Science Denier, he explains the denialist mentality, and he provides a strategy for helping deniers to accept facts, and just in time. He also includes his own experience of talking with science deniers, including members of the Flat Earth Society here in the United States. Dr. Mcintyre has taught philosophy at Boston University and other institutions, and he's received multiple teaching awards. He's also served as executive director of the Institute for Quantitative Social Science at Harvard University. It's a great pleasure to welcome back Dr. Lee Mcintyre, and thank you, sir, for joining us again today.
Thank you for having me back on the program. I appreciate it.
And I would like to open this with the kinds of strategies or tactics that you have discussed, which are very, very helpful in your book, that the denialists use when they're trying to persuade us. And then I'll see how you react to that. Would you tell us what they do, the cherry picking and so on?
Yes, that's not so much a strategy that they use to persuade us as I think a strategy they use to persuade themselves. It's the blueprint of reasoning that they follow without even thinking that they're following a blueprint. It's something that was discovered by cognitive scientists many years back, that all science deniers, evolution deniers, climate deniers, flat earthers, anti-vaxxers, they followed this same five-step flawed blueprint. And here's how it goes. First, they cherry pick evidence. They look for the facts that back up what they want to believe. Second, they engage in conspiracy theories, which we all know what those are. I can say a little more. Third, they engage in illogical reasoning. Fourth, they rely on fake experts and tend to denigrate real experts. And fifth, this is really my favorite, they insist that science has to be perfect in order to be credible. That's the most damaging one, I think, because it's this mentality that unless science can prove that they're right, then anything goes. And that's just such a fundamental misunderstanding of science that's often where I start with a science denier talking about that.
Yes. And you have engaged with a number of them. There are some wonderful anecdotes in your book of the way that you have engaged and your advice is so well taken here. Could you please give us examples of like how you engage with science deniers?
Yeah. Well, there are a couple of effective ways to do it. There was a study a few years back in Nature Human Behavior by Cornelia Bache and Philip Schmid, which talked about content rebuttal, which is when you talk about the actual content of their beliefs, and then something called technique rebuttal, which is when you really use that five-step rubric that we just talked about to help you talk not about what they believe, but why they believe it. That's the one that I use because that's the one that's really open to people who are not specialists in the content, right? If you're a climatologist, go nuts, talk about climate change and you've got all the facts at your fingertips. But I don't. And you'd think with flat Earth, for instance, it wouldn't be that hard, but they're quite well read in physics and have an excuse for everything, why everything that you bring up is wrong. Yeah. So what I do is talk about how they're reasoning, why they're reasoning the way that they are. And, as a philosopher, this type of engagement comes a little more naturally to me than other people, but anybody can really do it. My favorite question, once I've let them talk for a while, and shown that I'm listening to them, which is very important, I'll sometimes just ask questions. And my favorite question is this: what evidence, if I had it in my back pocket, could convince you that you were wrong? And that stops them. Because think about step 5 in the blueprint that we just discussed, thinking that science has to be, perfect in order to be credible. Science can't offer proof. Science is about warrant. It's about belief based on the preponderance of the evidence. This is why some scientific theories get overthrown in the face of new evidence. But to a denier, any change in science seems like, oh, you must have been lying before. So when I ask them what evidence could prove you wrong, and they can't answer, that's a very telling thing, because any scientist can answer that question, because scientific beliefs are the type of beliefs where one believes in evidences and willing to change their mind on the basis of new evidence. So just by asking questions about, well, why would you believe that? Or why would you trust that source but not this other one? Sometimes you can get past the script that the denier has, because if you bring up to the flat earther, well, what about the fact that ships disappear over the horizon hull first? Or, what about the Coriolis effect? Or, you can get quite technical with them. They're ready for that. They've got a script on that. They don't have a script to talk about why they believe what they believe.
Okay. And this is an underscore belief here, which is a little different from the scientific thinking that we'll get to in a minute. And your whole first chapter is about the flat earthers. I don't know if everybody is aware that the United States is one of, I think, few countries that has an actual flat earth society, very active. Could you please tell us about your experience?
Yeah.
That's an extreme belief. Not many people subscribe to one now.
Well, the trouble is that last part is not completely accurate. Okay. They are a growing movement, and it is worldwide. 7% of the population of Brazil believe that the earth is flat. That's 11 million people. Now, it's probably most virulent in the United States. And the problem is, so you mentioned the Flat Earth Society, which is a group that's still around. It's been around for a long time. I went to the convention for a rival group, which is called the Flat Earth International Conference. Okay. They hate the Flat Earth Society, and the Flat Earth Society hates somewhat like the People's Front of Judea and the Judean People's Front in The Life of Brian. I don't know if you know that
exactly. It reminds me
because they're so close, they hate one another. So I always want to be careful to say, I went to the FEIC conference.
Oh, I beg your pardon.
What the difference between the factions, I couldn't tell you, but they are important to point that out to everyone. What they believe is that the Earth is flat, that the continent of Antarctica is not actually a continent, but a mountain range spread out around the perimeter of the Earth to keep the water from falling off. That there's a crystal dome over the top of the Earth, which makes space travel impossible, but it still allows the light to shine through from the sun, moon, and stars, which are just outside the dome. They genuinely actually believe that and think that any evidence to the contrary is based on a giant hoax, a giant conspiracy run by the leaders of government of all the world, all the scientists, all the teachers, all the airline pilots. And if you ask them, well, why would they do that? You're playing on their turf. They have an answer for that. They love to talk about that. But if you ask, why do you believe it? Or what's your evidence for that? Then you're still on their turf a little bit, because they've got answers for that too. So you have to push them a little bit further. You have to bring that question to the next level. And it was an amazing experience to be there, because I'd been studying science deniers from my desk for 10 years, but I had never been in a situation where I went into a ballroom and there were 650 people who believed something and I didn't. And so it was just an incredible experience.
Yes, I am sure. Now, and that is what most people would consider that quite extreme, but there are a whole range of other ones, and you're quick to point out, like the anti-vax, this
Yes.
kinds of things. And I would like to get to that. Just before that, though, Dr. McIntyre, do you see a relationship with other types of belief, like religion and ideology, that these are the anti-science has a, what should I say, a profile much like that kind of?
I wish I had one. They're all conspiracy theorists. There's a profile, but of course, many conspiracy theorists, about the Kennedy assassination or something, that don't end up being evolution deniers or flat earthers or even climate deniers. I
understand.
So it's hard to come up with a profile. I would say one important point to make is that they would say that they're not anti-science.
Yes.
Now they would say they're not deniers either, but the point is this. I think of them as cafeteria skeptics. They go through the line and say, I'll take a little bit of this, but I'm going to leave all of that. Mm-hmm. So the flat earthers, for instance, flew to the convention. They thought that the airline pilots were in on the conspiracy, but they weren't so anti-science, for instance, that they didn't fly to the convention. Or when they got their tweet on their phones, which, by the way, have satellite internet traffic, right? So, they're picking and choosing what they're going to dispute and what they're not. So the question is really, is there a psychological profile for the people who are topically rejecting evolution, climate change, vaccines, flat Earth? And the answer is really no, except to say that if you believe one conspiracy theory, you're more likely to believe another. But for instance, I found that the flat earthers that I spoke with didn't disbelieve in climate change. Now, it was for a weird reason. It's because they thought there was a dome over the earth. So we basically live in a terrarium. And when you live in a terrarium, you need to take care of what's inside the terrarium. But so, were some of them, I didn't discern any political stripe, though a lot of science denial is politicized, the anti-vax and climate change. Religion, that's a tougher one. Quite a number of anti-evolutionists are religious. Quite a number of flat earthers are religious as well, though are quick to point out that that's not why they're flat earthers. And of course, most Christians are not flat earthers, but 70% of flat earthers are Christians. And they will tend to say things like, well, it's the only account that makes sense of Noah's flood. Yes, well, exactly. I don't even think that's true for, most Christians would believe in that. But the point is, then when I push them and say, oh, it's a faith-based belief, they say, oh, no, it's evidence-based. Well, then we're going to talk about the evidence against the round earth, the evidence in favor of flat earth, which is when I pull out my question about what evidence could convince you that you were wrong. Then they're playing on my terms. It would be easier if we had a profile. I don't think we do. It could, maddeningly, it can be anyone.
And because all of us have some kind of belief somewhere along the lines, just that if you're scientifically inclined, you might be more inclined to rethink things, correct.
I think that scientists are more inoculated from the bad belief, I think, is a way to think about it, right? We all have that moment of suspicion where we think, oh, is that a conspiracy? And then we realize, no, that's just a conspiracy theory. So there are... this is not a well-studied question yet, and I hope that the literature does more. There's a forthcoming book by Ashley Landrum out of, forget which school, I think it's Texas Tech or University of Texas, who's got a book. She's a psychologist, and she's got a book forthcoming on flat earthers. So I'll be really interested to know what her psychological profile is of them in particular.
Yes. What I should have said is, in terms of religion, I meant right wings of the different religions. I'm seeing this trend toward anti-science, for example, very pronounced in a lot of right wing, right of different religions, but that could be, that's like, say in climate, anti-climate, that sort of thing. But it may not be the case. But I'm glad that you're saying that we do need a profile. We need more profile so that we can address the problem better, because in this day and age, that's a real problem. In terms of education, do you see a distinction there? And that's two-part, having some science education in general, do you know, from country to country? And the other is specifically in the US. So first, let me just ask you, is there a relationship with a level of education and a background with some science education?
Well, again, it's a difficult question, right? Because some of the most virulent and most effective science deniers have a little science education, right? Because they're the ones who are best able to defend themselves, right? And make it sound like, no, I'm not a denier. I'm actually just looking at the evidence. I'm just the next Galileo, et cetera. Some science denial, most of the politicization of science denial comes from political ideology, and most of that comes from the right.
Yes.
To answer your previous question a little bit more specifically, does science education inoculate us from that? It can, to an extent, right? I think there is work to show that the more people know about science, the less likely they are to, fall for a conspiracy theory about science. But it doesn't mean, for instance, that the only people who are science deniers are people who are poorly educated, because that's just not actually the case. And you asked specifically about the United States. In my opinion, science education and really kind of anti-conspiracy theory, anti-poor reasoning education is not done very well in the United States.
Right.
If you look at Finland, you look at Denmark, you look at other countries, some other countries around the world, they will have a curriculum where they will specifically teach people, little kids, in school, how to recognize fake news, how to push back on things. We don't do such a good job of that in the United States, nor do we do a very good job sometimes in science education. And I think that's because some of it's science appreciation. It's, look at these geniuses who have discovered the facts and let's learn the facts, rather than realizing that in the history of science, there are a lot of false starts and mistakes.
Absolutely.
And that there's a lot of uncertainty, and that uncertainty is not a sign that scientists are liars, or even that they're wrong. It's just, it's part of science. So I would like to see the curriculum overhauled so that they do more in the history of science.
That's right.
Because I think if people really understand what science is, it's harder to buy the denialist ideas. Yes,
as these countries have demonstrated, as a matter of fact.
That's right.
That they teach evolution. In this country, we don't have a national curriculum, and that's a problem. Right. And then it really varies. Like in certain states, they won't teach evolution. They won't, there are a whole bunch of these
in court cases about this, or if they do teach evolution, they want intelligent design theory to be taught alongside it, which was actually, they lost that court case, but now the next level of it is what's called the teacher intellectual freedom bills, which means that the teachers can not be sued if they want to teach what they think is true.
Exactly.
So there's a whole agenda, a whole a campaign around what science education looks like in the United States to try to shoehorn in some of these denialist beliefs.
Yes, I want to sort of underscore this, that the U.S. differs substantially from other modern, well-developed economically, those top nations. The U.S. comes out near the bottom all the time on these things. And
Yes.
so science literacy is a big issue in this country compared to other developed nations and so on. So that's
Yes.
something to just, somebody needs to pay attention to this, simply because you can't operate in modern civilization without science. And we're going to have to change our thinking. And I think that's where you've been going in your books, that
Yes.
we have to develop this more scientific mentality, which is questioning and revising.
That's right.
Anyway, and thank you for that. But now you've also pointed out that we can't say it's all right-wing stuff when we talk about anti-science or a particular kind of denialism. It's not always right-wingers and or uneducated people. So your example was GMOs, of genetically modified organisms. Would you please tell us what you discovered and how you've approached it?
Okay. Yes, the thing that was compelling to me is that although you can pick out areas of science like climate change and evolution and anti-vax now, right, COVID denial, that have been politicized, there are examples, for instance, anti-vax before COVID came along,
yes,
where you had liberal people.
That's right.
And it was about, in fact, 50-50. If you look at who were the anti-vaxxers, now they might have been for different reasons, on the right and the left, but it hadn't been politicized yet. The one that seemed to me to be kind of the test case, the most interesting case, was GMOs, because this was a case where, you do find an awful lot of people on the left who are science deniers. And I say that understanding that one can be anti-GMO for different reasons, but the people who claim that GMO foods are dangerous to eat, that is a denialist belief. There are no scientific studies that have ever shown that genetically modified foods are dangerous to eat. The one study that everyone points to when I say that is a study that was methodologically flawed and retracted because there was a problem with the study. So any study that has not been retracted, they can't point to even one because they're not out there. Now, there are different reasons maybe to be against GMOs, but the thing that was fascinating to me about that is that means that people must be against GMOs for other reasons. And sometimes those reasons are political because they're anti-corporate, because, they're anti, for instance, Monsanto is one of the corporations that people are very virulently against, maybe rightly so for other reasons, but not for the fact that they've done genetically modified organism research, because that's like being against, all software because you don't like Microsoft, right? It's just, there are many other places that have done GMO research, including some that's not corporate or non-Monsanto. Now, Monsanto has a horrible corporate history, and they do things like they create genetically modified foods that can take more pesticide. Now, maybe the pesticides are dangerous and people don't want pesticides on the food. So maybe that's a legitimate reason to be against, Monsanto's particular GMOs. But even then, they cannot point to a study which shows that genetically modified foods in and of themselves are dangerous to eat.
Okay, there are two things here because I want to go back to another one, the anti-vax movement.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Before the COVID, I want to come back to that in just a minute. I think I had mentioned to you that I've talked to other people about GMOs. The thing that does come up is not whether the foods themselves are dangerous, unhealthy, or something. The first thing that I always hear is the issue of the patents and
Yes.
use of glyphosate, how damaging this has been to the environment, to plants, to and so on, and to health. And so that is the issue that I always seem to hear, rather than
Yes.
GMO foods themselves
Okay.
are dangerous.
Fair enough.
Some way.
Fair enough.
So I think there are two issues there, and
Yeah.
I don't know what you came across. You seem to have come across people that are against eating the foods for thinking they might be dangerous.
I'll give you an important example. I mean, there are plenty of reasons to be against Monsanto's corporate and farming practices, about their patents on the seeds, about the various objections that people have that have nothing to do with this scientific question about the danger to the foods.
Exactly.
But let me give you an example of how this slops over. There are liberal nonprofit organizations which have devoted themselves to being anti-GMO. Just simpliciter, anti-GMO, whether it's Monsanto produced or not, just they're anti-GMO.
Okay.
And what that means is, for instance, that golden rice, which is invented by university researchers, had no corporate ties to Monsanto or anyone else that I can find, invented this modification that rice could be enriched with vitamin A. Mm-hmm. Was a great boon, because something like a third of the world's population, I think it's even higher than that, gets most of their nutrition from rice every day. And if it could include a little vitamin A, that would stop a lot of kids from going blind, around the world. But golden rice has been stopped in its tracks by the anti-GMO researchers. Now, are they claiming that golden rice in and of itself is dangerous to eat? They tend not to. Rather, they'll say, oh, this is a slippery slope, because once you allow golden rice, then you're going to allow all these other GMOs, and that these will be dangerous. And they're not, and I have to say, they're not completely clear about what's dangerous and what's not. It's kind of this, remember the conspiracy theory piece? They're so suspicious that that they're not even willing to draw a distinction and say, well, this is okay, that's not. It's all, well, this is a slippery slope, we should ban it all. And it means that children around the world are dying, going blind, because they cannot get golden rice. And this has been the position of some prominent organizations that I'm not going to name on the air, which have had a campaign, but I do name in the book, have had a campaign again. I want to be careful how I say it, which is why I don't want to say it in the air. It's not that I'm afraid to name them. I want to be careful.
Right.
But I say it correctly in the book. The organizations that have devoted themselves to a campaign against GMOs for reasons that make it seem as if they're dangerous, that have nothing to do with the other issues.
Right. And very briefly, we're beginning to run out of time, but I want to just very briefly take you back to another anti-vax movement that, if you would explain that one to us, because everything has been sort of blocked out by the vax problem now, which we understand. But that other movement about where parents would not allow their children to be vaccinated, and these are routine childhood vaccinations.
Measles.
Please give us that story, and what kind of people are they?
Yes, so this was an example of before, COVID, but before vaccines were politicized based on COVID, you had quite a number of people from both the left and the right who believed that the measles vaccine, the classic MMR vaccine, might cause autism. Now, the work on this was fraudulent. It was not just sloppy, it was a fraud. The doctor who did it had his medical license pulled. And it was revealed later to be fraudulent work, knowingly false. But he's still celebrated as a hero by people who, are afraid of something that they needn't be afraid of. Now,
Right.
interesting here, the folks on the left tended to be anti-vax because they didn't trust big pharma. The people on the right tended to be anti-vax because they were libertarian. So they were anti-vax for different reasons,
Yes.
but they were allied in their idea that the MMR vaccine was dangerous because you couldn't prove that it didn't cause autism.
Right.
Of course, that's an impossibility in science. They did every study, known. There were studies of, the times that the thimerosal, which was the suspected agent, was banned in Europe when it wasn't banned here, and did autism rates tend to go up in the United States when they weren't going up in Europe? I mean, they did all of these studies, one after another after another. None of them came back to show that there was any suspicion, but people continue to believe it. That's another example of science denial.
Right. That I think that was a really particularly good one, because as you point out, it is for different reasons. You had the different mentalities centering on this one thing, and where there was no excuse for denial, no excuse for thinking that the vaccines were causing autism and so on. That really, a lot of studies were done on that. Thank you much. Before we have to close, and I regret it, do you see a range as, for example, from flat Earth, QAnon, that kind of thing, which seems really fringe, and the sorts of things we've just talked about, like the anti-vaccine for children, the kinds of things like GMOs, that which doesn't.
Yeah. I think that I don't know if there's a good justification for the ranking that I'm about to give, but one tends to hear people say, well, flat Earth is really fringe, and that climate denial and COVID denial and anti-vax, are more in the mainstream.
Yes.
But from my point of view, none of them are mainstream because they're all based on the same flawed reasoning. But here's the interesting thing about that spectrum, if you want to think of it that way.
Yeah.
Once I point out to a science denier that their reasoning pattern is identical to what the flat earthers are using, they get incensed, right? If I'm talking to a climate denier or an anti-vaxxer, and I say, don't you realize that the 5 steps of reasoning that you just displayed to me are identical to the one in the flat earthers? They'll say, don't lump me in with those people. Those people are crazy. And I'll say, yes, but you just told me a conspiracy theory where the Institute of Medicine was paid off to lie to the CDC, which sent out, the false. I mean, that's all conspiracy theory stuff. And the cherry picking, the GMO, anti-GMO people do that. I mean, they all follow the same 5-step strategy. So to me, because they're all deniers, they're all people that we need, we need to be concerned about. And they tend to be quite set in their views. I don't think there's a spectrum in terms of how committed they are to their views, because I haven't found that the flat earthers are more committed. It's not that they're more committed. The anti-vaxxers are just as committed. It's just that for whatever reason, people tend to think, well, anti-vax, that's more reasonable. Yvonne, why do they think it's more reasonable? I don't know, because it's more widespread. They're still believing a lie. They're believing a fraudulent piece of research that has convinced them where they shouldn't be convinced.
Okay. So that's a good answer, and it's something I hope you'll follow up in your next book too. More like this, so that we have a problem here somehow in a time when it is absolutely essential in terms of being citizens, in terms of representing people in governments, in terms of all professions, that people have to change their mentality. We need to shift toward a more, I hate to say a more rational, but it is, I mean by that, where we are able to doubt and revise and, look at evidence and so on. All of this, you've covered a lot in your book, and it's really great. I'd point out also, I think that there are a few scientists. This is much fewer probably today, but I can't say that for sure, than in the past, because science itself emerged out of sort of magic and so on. It just evolved. But there are scientists out there who believe rather bizarre things or harmful things like racism and so on. How would you talk to them? And I could give you very famous names.
This is the very toughest one. And the examples, the ones that are most prominent these days are the ones about climate change.
Yes.
Because the climate deniers love to grab any person they can. If they've got even one or two people who have legitimate PhD in the sciences and somebody who's on their side of it, they're going to grab onto that person and make their views, the very centerpiece. They'll invite them to give speeches at, their seminars and such. Look, all I can say about this is that there has always been diversity in science. Always. We still don't have 100% scientific consensus on evolution.
Yes.
But evolution is the backbone of biology. Nothing in microbiology or molecular biology or genetics makes sense except in light of evolution. So what do you say about the fringe? Well, what deniers say is, why do you think they're the fringe? Galileo was right. Semmelweis was right. Wegener was right. Sometimes the gadfly, the fringe person, ends up being vindicated. And boy, that's what you're going to see in climate change.
Okay.
At which point I say, show me the evidence. Don't just raise a bunch of skeptical questions and come up with some hypothesis. Show me the evidence. And the best people for assessing that evidence are their scientific colleagues. And to my understanding, the most prominent examples of climate scientists who are on the other side of it have basically been read out of the profession because they are not abiding by the good standards that their colleagues are. Naomi Oreskes did a study years back. It needs to be updated now, which found that there were out of thousands and thousands of papers that showed that anthropogenic climate change was true, there were only a handful that showed that it wasn't true. And then when they drilled down on those ones that weren't, they were all methodologically flawed. Every single one of them was methodologically flawed. So, it's not just that you need 100% consensus. You'll never have that. The question is, what do you say about the scientists who just will not give up, even in face of overwhelming evidence? Do you call them deniers? I think you have to. And to people who are shocked at that, I say, you know what? You should also be shocked at scientific fraud, but there's scientific fraud that exists as well. Those people are also read out of the profession. I'm not saying that the scientific deniers are fraudsters. Maybe they're not. But I know I've studied science long enough from outside it as a philosopher to know that there are sometimes when people get so jazzed about their own particular view that they cannot give it up, even when the evidence is overwhelmingly against them. And that is one of the roads that leads people to denial.
Right. And that just, again, proves your point. You need to educate people in a different way. And you make a very nice point of that in this book about how to do it. Don't just teach the science, teach how you think in science. Right. That would solve many problems for everybody. But you've done a wonderful job in this book. I've enjoyed all of your books, and we've talked about of them in the past. Looking forward to the next one. Do you know the publication date? Do you anticipate?
My next book is in progress. I can't reveal the title or anything about it. That's all right. But I do know it'll be out in fall 2023, which is a little late. I wish it were coming out earlier than that. But the reality of publishing is that it'll be a little while. And I guess I will tip my hand to say that it's about in general, about how the model of science denial has now metastasized to our
Yes.
larger problem of belief in general,
Yes.
which is where I think you end up having election denial
Yes.
or insurrection denial. It's the
Yes.
same model, the same 5-step model.
Yes.
That's in general what I'm writing about.
It's going to be very, very timely because it's so alarming that at this time you need rational thinking. You have people in Congress who subscribe to QAnon, all sorts of things. This is really a frightening move. And it is. I appreciate so much the work you have done. And
thank you.
Know that the public, your readers do as well. And Dr. McIntyre, thank you so much for joining us today. I really enjoyed the opportunity to talk with you. Best of luck.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me back on.
Okay, bye-bye.